Welcome to Las Vegas.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we'll get started. One of the things we talked about earlier in the remarks is that we try to get away from 30-second sound bites and really dig deep into policy issues. And we had,
if you like, I can go for 21 hours.
They sound motivated. There's plenty of hotel rooms here too. So, you know, we try to get beyond the 30-second soundbite and really dig deep into those issues.
Yep.
And we were talking about the presidential debate, which congratulations, getting your first one underneath your belt. You did a great job.
Thank you.
And it was a tough format. You have so many people on stage, you got a minute to respond, but there was one response that you had that really struck a chord with our grassroots. We had AFP watch parties all across the country, and that was about your dad's story. And I want you to talk about your family story, about the American dream, how you and your dad and your family were able to experience that, and what we've got to do so more young people can experience it today.
Well, Mark, thank you for that question. You know, I have been blessed to live the American dream as so many of us have. My mother is, and I want to start with my mom because I tell my dad's story so often that my poor mom gets offended. She says, "What, were you raised by wolves?" But you know, my mother's story, she's Irish and Italian, she was born in a working class family in Wilmington, Delaware. Her mother was the second youngest of 17 kids. They were Irish Catholic. They didn't know what else to do on a Saturday night. No one in the family had ever gone to college. And my mom became the first person ever to go to college. My grandfather, her father, was a difficult man. He was a drunk. And he did not think women should be educated. And he certainly didn't think his daughter should be the first person in the family to go to college. And my mom she's a shy person, like her son. But she has got a backbone of steel. And she stood up to her father. She ended up going to Rice University. And she graduated with a degree in math in 1956. And she became a computer programmer. She went to work at Shell. Now talk about two industries. Computer programming and the oil and gas industry, neither one of which was remotely welcoming to women. And she was at the intersection of both of them. And one of the things my mom used to tell me as a kid, she said she very deliberately didn't learn how to type. Because she said, look, it was the 1950s. I understood the world I was living in. She said, I didn't want to be walking down the hall and have a man stop me and say, sweetheart, would you type this for me? My mother wanted to be able to smile and with a very clean conscience say, I would love to help you out, but I don't know how to type. I guess you're going to have to use me as a computer programmer instead. And then my dad's story, my father was born in Cuba and grew up in Cuba. And as a kid, he fought in the Cuban Revolution. And when he was 17, they threw my dad into prison. And Batista's army tortured him, beat him halfway to death. And he fled Cuba in 1957 and came to America. He was 18 at the time. He couldn't speak English. He had nothing. He had $100 that was sewn into his underwear. And he got a job washing dishes. Made 50 cents an hour. Worked full-time, paid his way through school. And he and my mom ended up going on to start a small business together. Today, my dad is a pastor. He travels the country preaching the gospel.
Now, the Cruz family benefited from the American dream, and more we're starting to see, especially I mentioned earlier, millennials.
Yes.
And their future. There's less and less people who feel that the American dream is as available as it once was. What would you do under a Cruz presidency to reinvigorate the American dream?
You know, that is the most important question. Let me step back for a second. I'll get to the specifics of the question, but I want to step back for a second and observe that right now today, a majority of Americans believe that our kids will have a worse life than we did. 65%. That may be the most un-American idea you can think of. And I believe the central issue in 2016 is going to be exactly what you asked about, reigniting the promise of America. Getting back to that fundamental commitment that our kids will have a better life than we did, and that their kids will have a better life than they did. We are in the midst of what I call the Great Stagnation. For 6.5 years, we've seen out-of-control spending and taxes and regulation. And everyone here understands cause and effect. Every time the federal government does that, you see misery and stagnation and malaise. On the flip side, every time the federal government pursues tax reform and regulatory reform, the result has been incredible economic growth. Growth doesn't come from government. It comes from the men and women here. It comes from the private sector. In order to bring back jobs and growth and opportunity, tax reform, and I'm campaigning on a simple flat tax. Where every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. And when we do that, we should abolish the IRS. And then regulatory reform. We have seen federal regulators descend from Washington like locusts. I was in West Texas some years ago. I asked a bunch of folks out there, I said, what's the difference between regulators and locusts? And I said, well, the thing is, you can't use pesticide on a regulator. And this old West Texas farmer, he leaned back, he said, want to bet?
You know, one thing that we see when we're knocking doors all across the country, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or independent, people believe that the government is spending too much money.
They're right.
How would you reduce spending as the President of the United States? What would be your key areas?
You know, the biggest thing is we have to take on what I call the Washington cartel. I have a new book that just came out a few weeks ago called A Time for Truth. There it is right there. And there, very good. In the book, I talk a lot about the Washington cartel, which is career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interests and grow and grow and grow government. And the reason we have, do you know there are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible? Not a one of them is as good. But all of those provisions were added because lobbyists came in and they were seeking favors. And government is in the business of picking winners and losers because it entrenches politicians. You know, there's an old joke that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. My wife says I resemble that remark. But what happens is you get career politicians. Here's the way you stay in office. Here's how government grows. You want to cut a bipartisan deal? Get a bunch of you around a table. You say, we'll spend for your project, your project, your project, your project, your project, your project. $1 trillion, we're done. And the people that lose are the taxpayers. The people that lose are our kids and grandkids that are getting bankrupted. And the only way to change it is we need leaders who are willing to stand up to the Washington cartel.
One classic example of the Washington cartel is the export-import bank. And
That would be the Export-Import Bank.
that was an issue.
But the Obama Justice Department just cut his mic.
That was an issue which we were talking about earlier tonight that not a lot of people knew about. And it was one of those bills that, it was created underneath FDR.
Yep.
It was a rubber stamp. It would get bipartisan support. And then you gave a pretty famous speech on the floor of the Senate talking about XM and some other things, broken promises. Let's get more into XM.
Sure.
Give me your read on that and the future of Export-Import Bank this fall.
Well, listen, as the men and women here know, because I'll tell you, AFP has been critically important, helping educate and energize and mobilize the grassroots to stop cronyism and corporate welfare. And the XM Bank is a classic example of corporate welfare. It is over $100 billion in taxpayer-guaranteed loans, goes primarily to a handful of giant corporations. And yet those corporations all have lobbyists that spread money around Washington like crazy. And you end up having a bipartisan collection of career politicians that discover, hey, I can get reelected if I keep getting these checks. Anytime someone tells you it's not about the money, it's about the money. And so we had a battle. Thankfully, the XM Bank expired on June 30th by operation of law. And so I and Mike Lee and a number of House conservatives, we had a press conference congratulating John Boehner and Mitch McConnell. We said, you know what? We just had a major conservative victory. The Export-Import Bank has expired. And all we have to do to preserve this victory is do nothing. If there's one thing Congress should be able to do, it's do nothing. And yet we saw last month there was an epic drag-down battle on the floor because Mike Lee and I stood up together to try to defeat the Export-Import Bank. And we faced the unleashed ferocity of Republican leadership. And I gave a speech where I outlined exactly what they were doing. And they weren't happy about it. Listen, all of us are frustrated out of our minds. You know why? We keep winning elections, and then the people we elect don't do what they said they would do. We were told if only we had a Republican House of Representatives, then things would be better. So what happened? We rose up in incredible numbers in 2010 and won an historic majority. And very little changed. Then we were told the problem is the Senate. It's Harry Reid.
They know him.
So what happened? Yeah, sadly, y'all have suffered with Mr. Reid a long time. So what happened? The American people rose up in incredible numbers in 2014. We won an historic tidal wave election. Largest majority in the House since the 1920s. Picked up 9 Senate seats and retired Harry Reid as majority leader. It's been about 8 months since we've had a Republican majority in both houses. What the heck have we done with it? It's worse than nothing. It's even worse than nothing. First thing when we came back is Republican leadership joined up with Harry Reid to pass a $1 trillion omnibus bill filled with corporate welfare and pork. In December, when I stood up to try to fight it again, they excoriated Mike Lee and me. How dare you get in the way? We're doing business. Then we voted to fund Obamacare, voted to fund President Obama's executive amnesty, voted to fund Planned Parenthood, and then Republican leadership led the fight to confirm Loretta Lynch as Attorney General. Now let me ask you, which of those decisions is one iota different than if Harry Reid and the Democrats had been there? And so fast forward to the XM Bank, what you saw was leadership in both houses doing backflips, using every procedural tool they could to jam through the XM Bank. You know, sometimes grassroots activists ask me, they say, is our leadership just not very competent? Are they unwilling to fight? And it's actually worse than that. They are competent, and they are very willing to fight. They're just not fighting for us. And so on the XM Bank, Mike Lee and I used every procedural tool in the Senate to delay reauthorizing the XM Bank. I observed we were witnessing what I call the McConnell-Reed leadership team. People think it's two parties, but it's the party of Washington. They were arm in arm, saying, hey, we got a bunch of lobbyists writing checks. We need to take care of them and reauthorize the Export-Import Bank. And by the way, I tried to bring up, for example, an amendment to block this Iran deal until Iran recognizes Israel's right to exist. Republican leadership blocked that. Mike Lee tried to bring up an amendment to defund Planned Parenthood. Republican leadership blocked that. We tried to bring up amendments to stop sanctuary cities, to pass Kate's Law, to address real priorities of actually the men and women who elected us. The problem is leadership in Washington listens to K Street and Wall Street. And for the priorities of big business, for the cronyist priorities, they'll fight tooth and nail. But for the issues actually that you get any town hall, if we put up a whiteboard right here and ask the men and women here, give us the 10 top issues we should be focused on. Not a single one of those 10 makes the priority of leadership. Now, the good news is Mike and I, using procedural tools available in the Senate, delayed it so long that the XM today is still expired.
Sir, we're getting a lot of intelligence from the House that's saying that they're going to try to do it again this fall.
Right.
What's your current read on the future of XM in this after the August recess?
I am hopeful that House conservatives will stand strong. One of the reasons Mike and I delayed it and shined a light on it is it gave an opportunity for House conservatives to gain steam, to gain strength. It gave an opportunity for all of y'all to encourage House conservatives. This matters. What leadership plans to do is this fall, we're going to come back with a conference report on the highway bill. And in all likelihood, leadership is going to try to jam the Export-Import Bank on the conference report sometime this fall and try to force it through. Now, sadly, in the Senate, listen, when Mike and I were standing there fighting this fight, there was not another Republican senator on the Senate floor standing with us and fighting alongside us. We have 54 senators who are Republicans. They weren't there. If it's going to be stopped, it's going to be stopped in the House, and I'm hopeful that shining a light on it mattered. But let me say something else. This fight underscores the need for a strong conservative president. We're not going to fix this from Congress. If you think about it, Ronald Reagan in 8 years, he never had a rock-ribbed conservative Congress. And yet, because he stood for principle, he passed fundamental tax reform with Tip O'Neill and a Democratic House. And here's the difference. If I'm elected president, I will tell leaders of both parties in Congress, if you send me a bill with corporate welfare and pork and cronyism in it, I will veto it. You know, that's a great point. American families are working longer and harder. They're making less.
and they just can't afford to send more money to Washington. And Americans for Prosperity, like yourself, we've got a pretty common sense approach that as a family member, we can't spend more money than we can take in, and the government continues to do that. So under a Cruz presidency, how would you get this balanced, get the budget balanced?
To get the budget balanced, number one, you got to take on the Washington cartel. You got to take on the cronyism. You've got to take on the subsidies. You got to take on all of the mandates. Now that means you've got to be willing to stand up to something like the XM Bank. You've got to be willing to stand up to something like the sugar subsidies, which, by the way, it's interesting. Sugar is a good example. Do you know that sugar crops consist of 0.2% of the farmland in America, and yet they contribute 40% of the lobbying money? Because under federal law, the price of sugar is about 60% higher in America than it is in the rest of the world. Now, for a handful of very wealthy sugar producers, that's a good deal. They write a whole lot of checks. You know who gets hurt? Any other business that uses sugar. So whether it is chocolates or candies, or whether it's cakes, or whether it's sodas, you get people who are losing their jobs. For every one job in the sugar industry that mandate gains us, costs 3 jobs in other industries. But that's an example where you need an administration that will take that on. You've also got to have, if you look at the federal budget, the most important factor is economic growth. I'm a numbers guy. If you look at the numbers of the budget, there's only one first-order variable, and that's growth. Since World War II, our economy's grown on average 3.3% a year. There are only 2 4-year periods where growth averaged less than 1% a year. 1978 to 1982, coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration, and 2008 to 2012, where it averaged 0.9% a year. It's why my top priority in the Senate from day one has been economic growth. Because with growth, we can solve the deficit and debt. With growth, we can tackle unemployment. With growth, we can rebuild our military to keep America safe. With growth, we can strengthen Social Security. Without growth, it's impossible. The numbers don't work. If we stay at stagnant 1% and 2% growth rates, you can't cut enough to balance the federal budget. The math simply doesn't work. Because with growth, and so let's go back to the last 4-year period, 78 to 82. What happened? Reagan came in, and he pursued tax reform and regulatory reform. He cut taxes, he simplified the tax code, he reduced the burdens of regulation. Does anyone know what GDP growth was in 1984? The 4th year of Reagan's presidency? 7.2%. Booming growth. Millions of people lifted out of poverty into prosperity. And growth for the budget, you got to understand it's a double whammy. When you see that kind of growth, you got expenditures going down because people are going off of unemployment. They're going off of food stamps. They're going off of disability. So your expenditures are going down. And at the meantime, they're getting jobs. So they're paying taxes into the system, and everyone else's wages are going up. When you have growth, wage rates stop stagnating. They start going up because employers are competing for talent. So you asked about young people. Young people right now coming out of school. They got student loans up to their eyeballs. And they're scared, am I going to get a job? If I do get a job, am I going to be a part-time barista at Starbucks? Or am I going to gain some skills, start working towards a career where I can provide for my kids? If we pursue the same policies of tax reform and regulatory reform, we can get the same sort of growth so that young people coming out of school get 3, 4, 5 job offers. Young people today have never seen a world like that. But every time we pursued tax reform and reg reform, in the 1920s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s, that's exactly what happened. Calvin Coolidge did it. John F. Kennedy did it. Ronald Reagan did it. And I'll tell you, if I'm elected, we're going to do it together.
You mentioned sugar. In the Midwest, it's corn. A lot of times it's natural gas or oil. And you'll have a lot of politicians say, well, I'm free market, but I don't want to hurt my state. And I want there to be an unfair advantage. How can we get people to demonstrate leadership from all across the country and say, we're going to come to this table together, we're going to look at all these options and to do it at the same time? You think there's a possibility to do that?
There is with presidential leadership. And there is with the grassroots backing it up. You know, the Reagan Revolution only worked because millions of Americans rose up like a tidal wave. And it changed the incentives in Washington. Suddenly, politicians were more scared to do the wrong thing than they were to do the right thing. That's how you change it. You know, you're right that lots of people follow different standards. You know, I talked about sugar a minute ago. Listen, Texas is one of the largest sugar producers in the country. That doesn't make them happy in my state when I say what I just said. I'll give you another example. About 6 months ago, there was an agriculture summit in your home state of Iowa. And just about every Republican presidential candidate came to the Ag Summit. And every single one of them at that Ag Summit pledged to support the ethanol mandate, including several who had opposed it previously, who did triple backflips on the stage to land and in front of Iowa say, I'm for it. And the one exception was me. And when I told folks there, I said, listen, I support ethanol. I support biofuels. When it comes to energy, I think we should pursue all of the above. God has blessed this nation with incredible natural resources. But I don't think it should be government picking winners and losers. And that's why I've introduced legislation to phase out the ethanol mandate. And I got to tell you, Mark, you're from Iowa. This was a gathering of the 1,000 largest ethanol producers in the state. I didn't know if I'd get booed and they throw tomatoes at me. And I told them, and the whole purpose of this gathering was kiss the ring of ethanol. That's why that whole summit was held. And I told them, I said, listen, I understand that a lot of folks here would much rather that I say I'm for the ethanol mandate forever and ever, amen. But every one of us has seen politicians who say one thing and do another. And we all know what happens. They go to Washington and they don't do what they said. And I told the folks there, I said, listen, with me, you can count on me for two things. I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to do what I said I would do. And here's something that will encourage you. The reaction among the Iowa ethanol producers was exactly the same. It was a round of applause, and when I left the stage, I got a standing ovation.
I think more and more of the American people are starting to realize that we just can't continue, business as usual. And you've had these politicians make promise after promise. And it could be sugar, it could be oil, it could be entitlement reform. And all those promises have added up. And now we've got this enormous deficit that we're going to pass on to our children and to our grandchildren. What kind of leadership can you show to say, we've got to change the status quo, and we've got to make some tough decisions that electorally might scare people without backbone in Washington?
Well, let me answer that two ways. Let me start by just telling you a story, and it's a story I mentioned in my book a minute ago. The opening chapter of my book describes the fight over the debt ceiling. You may remember a little over a year ago we had a big fight about the debt ceiling. The title of the chapter is Mendacity, which gives you a hint of some of what's to come. We have a debt ceiling, and that fight started with President Obama demanding a so-called clean debt ceiling, A clean debt ceiling is trillions more in debt with no spending reforms whatsoever. Now, that wasn't surprising that Obama asked for that. It was an audacious ask, but we've gotten used to that with this president. What was surprising is what happened next. In the House of Representatives, House Republican leadership teamed up with 192 Democrats to give President Obama exactly what he asked for. A clean debt ceiling, trillions more in debt with no spending reforms. They overruled about 200 Republicans. The next week it came to the Senate. Now, the ordinary rules of the Senate are to take up a debt ceiling takes 60 votes. That's been the way the Senate has operated for many, many years. But any rule in the Senate can be changed by unanimous consent. But unanimous consent, as the name suggests, takes the affirmative agreement of all 100 senators. So the week we take this up at our Tuesday at lunch, Republican leadership stands in front of all of us and says, we are asking every one of you to affirmatively consent to lower the threshold for Harry Reid to take up the debt ceiling from 60 votes to 50 votes. And our leadership told us, every one of us, all 45 Republicans in this room, we should agree to this for two reasons. Number one, if we do it, it will pass. And hallelujah, hallelujah, that's the outcome we want. We want the debt ceiling raised with no conditions because we're scared of this issue. We don't want to take it on. We don't want to fight on this. But they said the second reason everyone should agree to it is if we do it, the Democrats will have the votes to pass it on their own, which means every one of us can vote no. And we can tell our constituents we opposed what we just consented to allow happen. I have to admit, I sat there just kind of stunned. I assumed they would come up with some weenie proposal to ask for next to nothing. I didn't think the opening offer would be abject surrender. And so my response, I raised my hand and I said, listen, there's no universe in which I can consent to that. I spent 2 years traveling the state of Texas, telling Texans, if you elect me, I will fight with every breath in my body to stop the out-of-control spending and debt that is bankrupting our kids and grandkids. If I were to affirmatively consent to make it easier for Barack Obama and Harry Reid to add trillions in debt while doing nothing, zero, to fix the underlying problem, I think it would be both dishonest and unfaithful to the men and women who elected me. There's nothing I've done in all my time in the Senate that has engendered more anger, hatred, venom, and animosity than that simple act.
You're just talking about the debt ceiling, and mysteriously the national debt has been frozen in place for like the last 100 days. I don't know how that works, but they're also talking about potential debt limit increase again this fall. What's your read on that, the timeline, and what are the major factors that we got to look at?
We don't know the timing, and with the debt ceiling, the Treasury Department can fiddle with the numbers so much that we don't know the likely timing. Sadly, we are likely to know where leadership will be, which is they're going to be in the same place, that they're going to want to raise the debt ceiling and pass a continuing resolution and fund everything and do little to nothing in exchange for that. What the heck are we there for then? I mean, what exactly are we doing? It was interesting that debt ceiling argument, for the next 3 days at each of those lunches, virtually every other Senate Republican yelled and screamed at me. The only senator who spoke up and stood with me was Mike Lee. But one of the things that was asked, one of the senators said, Ted, why do you want to throw 5 Republicans under the bus? Because if the threshold was 60, then 5 Republicans had to vote to take it up in order to get to it. And I remember saying, look, I don't want to throw any Republicans under the bus. It's leadership that's asking you to jump under the bus. Every one of us campaigned telling our constituents the same dang thing I did. All I'm asking you to do is actually do what you told the people you would do.
You know, one topic we really haven't covered yet has been health care.
Yeah.
And you've been a leading opponent of Obamacare. And, you know, the grassroots, we've heard this mantra, you know, repeal and replace. We've had a couple unfortunate court decisions. What's the future of health care in this country?
This election's going to determine that. Here is the sad reality. There are an awful lot of politicians in Washington, including a lot of Republicans, who are largely resigned to Obamacare being a permanent feature of our economy. I will tell you this, if I'm elected president, we are going to repeal every word of Obamacare. And let me explain why and how. Because none of us are Pollyannish or naive. That's not easy to do. The Washington cartel doesn't want to do it. But let's look to the model of the last time we broke the Washington cartel. The last time we broke the Washington cartel was the Reagan Revolution in 1980. Now, if you look at, imagine for a second, all of us were sitting in this ballroom, and the year were 1979. And Ronald Reagan was sitting with the two of us here on the stage. You and I were both a lot shorter then. But imagine if Ronald Reagan in 1979 had said to this ballroom, if you elect me president, we're going to cut the top marginal rate from 70% to 28%. We're going to dramatically simplify the tax code. We're going to reduce the burdens of regulations on small businesses, and the current stagnant economic growth, less than 1% a year, by the fourth year of my presidency will be 7.2%. At the same time, Iran is going to release our American hostages the day I am sworn into office. And within a decade, we will win the Cold War and tear the Berlin Wall to the ground. Now, to be honest, an awful lot of folks would have said, that guy is bark at the moon crazy. See, they're setting off the fire alarms, they're that upset. Under all of the rules of Washington in 1979, everything that Reagan would have said was impossible. Now, he didn't go to Washington and try to convince a bunch of old bulls. Come on, Republicans, you got to change what you're doing. Because they weren't listening. Instead, he did exactly what AFP is doing. He traveled the country, he took the case to the people, and he built a grassroots tsunami. How do we actually repeal Obamacare? I intend to make 2016 a referendum on repealing Obamacare.
Now, there are some conservatives that take a purist approach, and they say, we're not going to touch it, we just want to repeal it. Part of Americans for Prosperity's legislative agenda this year, our Reform America agenda, which you can see on reformamerica2015.com, was that we can repeal the medical device tax.
Yep.
You know, we can institute the 40-hour work week. There's some short-term measures that we can do to help the American people right now. Do you support those measures?
Yes. Look, my view on Obamacare, I'm happy for death by 1,000 cuts. This thing is a disaster. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, have been forced into part-time work, have lost their health care, have lost their doctors, have seen their premiums skyrocket. You know, President Obama told the American people, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it. He also said the average family's premiums would drop $2,500. In fact, the average family's premiums have risen $3,000. I'll tell you what I've said. I've said a number of times, all right, anyone here, if your premiums have dropped $2,500, you should vote for Hillary. I'll take everybody else. And I want to loop back, Mark, to something that you said at the beginning. You know, I view my political philosophy as what I call opportunity conservatism, which is that every policy we think about or talk about, we should focus like a laser on opportunity, on easing the means of ascent up the economic ladder. We should ask, how does it impact the least off among us? How does it impact young people and Hispanics and African Americans and single moms and people who are struggling to achieve the American dream? How can we facilitate climbing the economic ladder? I try to think of everything, the policy issues, from the perspective of my dad when he was washing dishes making 50 cents an hour. If my dad were still washing dishes today, the odds are very, very high he would have lost his job. Because the people who have been laid off are the teenage dishwashers. It's not the CEOs. It's the people who are struggling that are getting laid off in massive numbers with out-of-control taxes and regulations on small businesses. And if he hadn't been laid off, the odds are overwhelming he would have had his hours forcibly reduced to 28 or 29 hours a week, because Obamacare kicks in at 30 hours a week. And you can't feed your kids, you can't pay your way through school on 28 hours a week. That's who we're fighting for. And the other side, you know how we're going to win the general election in 2016? We are going to make this a populist campaign of hardworking men and women who want to believe again in the promise of America, and we are going to run against the bipartisan corruption of Washington that Hillary Clinton embodies.
We've got time for one more question. And the people that are in this room are the heart and soul of the grassroots movement of Americans for Prosperity. And I just want you to talk about how the phone calls they make, the door knocks they do back in the district, the emails they send you. Just tell them how much of an impact what they're doing every single day has on you and your office.
Mark, it is impossible to overstate the impact each of you is having. If you look at the fights we've had over the last several years, you look at the fight in 2013, following the Newtown shooting, when Barack Obama and Harry Reid tried to come after our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Millions of Americans lit up the phones. I was proud to help lead the fight to stop those unconstitutional gun control efforts. But it wasn't anything I did that won that fight. Nobody cares what I say. What won that fight was millions of you on the ground speaking out, lighting up the phones, email, Facebook, Twitter, terrified. A bunch of politicians. And liberty is never safer than when politicians are terrified. Fight after fight after fight, Obamacare. When we had the fight to defund Obamacare, 2.1 million Americans signed a national petition to defund Obamacare, melted down the phones in Washington, scared the living daylights out of politicians. One of my colleagues, a Republican senator, literally made a fist in one of those meetings where he was yelling at us, and he pounded the table and he said, "My constituents keep calling me." It's one of the few times I was genuinely speechless. You look at the Washington cartel. Chuck Schumer at the Democrats joined with a whole bunch of Republicans to pass a massive amnesty bill. The American people rose up, the grassroots rose up in incredible numbers, and because of you, we defeated the amnesty bill in Congress. And let me make a closing observation. Our presidential campaign, we're seeing incredible momentum. Of all of the Republican candidates, do you know which campaign has raised the most hard money? We have. That is because 175,000 contributions came in at tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. We're building a grassroots army. The average contribution was $68. That is the power of the grassroots. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing. It's how we're winning the fight. 2016 is going to be an election like 1980. We're seeing the Reagan Revolution all over again, and we will win, as Reagan said, by painting in bold colors and not pale pastels.
That concludes our event for this evening. The Road to Reform series continues next week in Columbus, Ohio. Sarah Cruz will be there with us. Thank you, Las Vegas, and thank you, Sarah Cruz. I'll take a photo right here.